sarò mia vita. Accogli intanto mia speme anima mia, accogli intanto quest'occhio verso ultimo pianto.
You've just heard is not well known today, perhaps unjustly, nor is the opera where it first appeared in Niccolo Zingarelli's Romeo and Juliet. But the aria, Ombra Adorata, was a real smash hit in Napoleonic Europe. It outshone the opera and it far outlasted its creator in the role of Romeo, the castrato Girolamo Crescentini. The aria is Romeo's swan song in the opera. We discover him in the Capulet tomb, mourning over Juliet's supposedly dead body. Having drunk a draught of poison, he finds himself calm and calls on Juliet's shade to expect him in Elysium after one last lament. Like modern hits, Ombra Adorata was covered by innumerable professionals and amateurs. First, as part of Zingarelli's opera, by 1827, it had travelled from Naples all across Italy to Monaco, Lisbon, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Vilnius, Moscow, Prague, London, New York, and Buenos Aires. But the aria was also remixed, retexted, and rearranged, put in new narratives, in new operas, in concerts, in dramatic freestanding tableaux, and in catchy instrumental arrangements for violin, flute, or harp, which are really quite cheesy. It's found in printed scores commemorating famous performers, in private albums for young ladies, and in singing manuals with voluminous notes on ornamentation. The aria was discussed textually in newspapers and periodicals, in memoirs, autobiographies, and at least one short story. It transported listeners through time and space, it launched many careers, and made the Emperor Napoleon weep. It won a knighthood as well for Crescentini, on whom Napoleon bestowed the Iron Crown of Lombardy, an act one contemporary described as the only piece of folly in the civil government of that great man. In 1803, the aria also featured in another conscious piece of folly, a parody devised by Empress Maria Theresa. Here it was retitled Ombra Amalata, or Sick Shade, and it was interrupted by a chorus of coughs, snores, and sneezes. Well, this evening, with or without coughs, snores, and sneezes, 200 odd years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and 400 years after the death of Shakespeare, we want to explore what made this music so popular and so moving for early 19th century audiences. And I want to show something of how and why composers, performers and writers were so drawn to play over and over again and to play with this incarnation of Romeo. To do this, we're joined by 3 singers, a harpsichordist and 3 readers who'll shed light on the literary life of Ombra Adorata. Please save any applause for the performers until the end of the evening, though then please do applaud very loudly. We'll be looking at play, the theme of this festival, in the sense of role-playing, of gender play, of playing with listeners' emotions, and aesthetic free play. But most especially, I think, at play as an activity characterised by repetition, adaptation, and transformation. Anyone who's played with small children knows the demand for games and stories to be repeated and repeated. What looks like boredom from the outside creates the pleasures of novelty against a backdrop of expectation of the familiar, which is also pleasurable in itself. And creative play too involves transformations, whether transforming children into things unlike themselves, into villains and heroes, or transforming egg cartons into crocodiles, or transposing one medium or kind of object into another, something a number of romantics try to do in representing music in words. Well, the very first performance of Ombra Adorata already involved transformations and adaptations. First, of course, from Shakespeare's play into Zingarelli's opera of 1796. The opera's libretto by Giuseppe Foppa drew vaguely on Shakespeare and on a French version of the drama from the late 18th century. Thanks to this play, we have a final scene where, after Romeo's so-called last lament, Juliet wakes up ready for another sing before they die for good. Like Shakespeare's Romeo, Zingarelli's is a young and impetuous lover. But the high voice of the castrato, or the countertenor you've just heard, shouldn't fool us into thinking that he's an immature boy or an effeminate kind of lover. Although castrated singers were going out of fashion in this period, for Zingarelli they were still the obvious masculine heroes of opera, their characters as well as their voices being hyper-powerful and hyper-lofty. Alongside the shift from Shakespeare to the opera stage, there's another adaptation at the start of Ombra Adorata's career. That's because the version which travelled across Europe had in fact been tinkered with, rewritten and improved on by Crescentini himself, an accomplished composer and singing teacher who knew exactly how to show off his voice. Now, showing off Crescentini's particular voice with its timbre, its technical capabilities, was also about showing off his entire embodied character and ethos, especially his ability to move the emotions. So while earlier castrato superstars like Farinelli were compared with virtuoso instrumentalists like violinists, and even with racehorses, Crescentini was instead admired for playing on listeners' heartstrings. Ombra Adorata seems to have been a real vehicle for this kind of effect, and an intensely moving piece for early 19th century audiences. Like many showstoppers of the era, it met a romantic taste for natural pathos and sentiment over artificial brilliance. Yet Ombra Adorata also played with listeners' hearts in a more unusual way. It was noted not only for being intensely moving, but also for its malleability. In this sense, it not only fails to be Romeo's last lament that happens in his duet with Juliet, the aria is also not necessarily a lament at all, at least in the way we expect. Here's how the French novelist Stendhal remembered it in his Memoirs of Rossini, first published in English in 1824.
When Crescentini sang the air Ombra Dorata Aspetta, he gave such a shade of spontaneous feeling to the varied inflection of his voice as the impulse of the moment called forth. It appeared, at the instant he was singing it, that such ought to be the sentiment of an impassioned lover who is about to rejoin the object of his affections. Velluti, on the contrary, in giving the same words, has another shade of feeling. He takes a different view of the subject. With him, it is melancholy and pensive reflection on the common fate of the two lovers. No master, however transcendent his abilities, could ever succeed in painting those innumerable and delicately varied shades which form the perfection of Crescentini's manner. Shades that are infinitely diversified according to the state of the singer's voice or the degree of illusion or of enthusiasm by which he is animated. A singer, to attain perfection in singing, must yield to the inspirations of the moment. A great singer is a being essentially nervous. This is quite the opposite temperament to that required for a player on the violin. In fine, it is impossible for a master to be acquainted with all the resources of a singer's voice, which can be known only to the possessor, who has spent 20 years of his life in forming it and studying its powers. Let an ornament be executed, I do not say ill, but feebly and without spirit, and its charm is instantaneously destroyed. You are in heaven, and, in an instant, you find yourself in a box of the opera. Nay, what is worse, perhaps in the midst of a singing school.
In the hands of star performers, then, this music, Stendhal suggests, is emotionally adaptable, transforming its sort of profile to convey either joyful expectation and contentment or deep sorrow. To quote the longer and slightly later French edition of Stendhal's book, Crescentini, quote, gave his voice and its inflections a vague and general colouring of contentment. The scene's pathos here has to derive from a contrast between Romeo's contentment and his funereal surroundings and needless death. For Velluti, meanwhile, another star castrato, Ombra Adorata was itself melancholy and pensive, a true lament for the singer. We can understand why this particular piece was so emotionally adaptable, partly through its formal features. The recitative and aria are in a major key, so we expect to hear something sort of joyful or tranquil. The motive in the accompaniment, you've heard Dan playing on the harpsichord, can also suggest playfulness, tripping along in simple scales and arpeggios. This is somewhat offset by the melody itself. The theme starts away from the tonic in the vocal part and outlines two minor triads in a row, from F sharp to A and from E to G. It's quite a long time until we have a phrase where the singer's voice ends on the tonic, giving us an absolutely settled feeling of arriving home in D major. There are some similar tricks in a piece Crescentini would have known well, Gluck's very famous aria from Orfeo, Che farò senza Euridice. This is Orfeo's lament after having lost his wife in the journey from Hades. When some people found Gluck's aria too cheerful, he admitted that if the tempo and the expression were just slightly off, the music would become a dance for marionettes. Now, Stendhal is not saying that Ombra Adorata becomes a dance for marionettes. He's connecting its changeable emotions not with wrong interpretations, but with the proper changefulness of the virtuoso singer. Beyond a kind of natural contrast between Crescentini and Velluti, Crescentini's own voice, he says, has varied inflections, delicately varied shades, and these are set in play according to his spontaneous, changeable feelings in the moment of performance. So like people playing chess or playing football, great singers have to have the freedom to improvise and seize the moment. For Stendhal, there's an ulterior motive to telling the story of art in this way. In the 1820s, he thinks this serious play of the virtuoso is under threat. Composers like Rossini want to control and prescribe singers' ornaments, squeezing the life out of them. If you know Stendhal's political background as a supporter of Napoleon, it's not so surprising that he sees this repressive control of singers beginning around 1814, shortly before the fall of Napoleon and the rise in both France and Italy of authoritarian regimes. A few years later, in his novel The Red and the Black, Stendhal called this age a century of boredom, where no one dared to have a spark of vivacity or independence. In Parisian salons, he writes, fearful of talking about anything which might arouse a suspicion that they were thinking, people fell silent after one or two elegant remarks about Rossini or the weather. So a singer's power to transform the sentiment and the inflections of this aria helped to make it the success that it was. This is really worth highlighting because as notes on a page, the aria looks technically simple and conventional to the point of real banality. You know, it goes bum bum ba-dum bum bum, bum bum ba-dum bum bum, and not much else happens for quite a while. In a sense, the aria's very unremarkableness is a kind of key to its success. Like a model with blank, flawless skin and even features, the aria was a perfect vehicle for decoration, interpretation and play. For the German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, Crescentini's own ornaments in the piece were like the brilliant jewellery which beautifies the fair, beloved countenance, making the eyes shine more brightly and colouring the lips and cheeks a deeper purple. First published in 1814, Hoffmann's tale, called Ombra Adorata, tells a deceptively simple story of a weary and irritable man listening with growing elation to a concert with a recitative and aria at its heart. The singer is a soprano, but one who captures the spirit of Crescentini as a composer and performer, adding ornaments without obscuring the music's essential simplicity. With this in mind, let's hear our second performance of Ombra Adorata.
Te cosa lo indiviso
performance practice is really crucial to bringing this piece alive and its changeableness alive. Rather unusually, we're fortunate to have a number of sources that suggest how singers played with the score of Ombra Adorata. Some purport to show Crescentini's own ornamentation, though they probably show an idealised version of everything he could have done rolled into one performance. Some refract singers' practices through instrumental transcriptions, and some are amateur sort of little handwritten notes on printed scores. These are the kinds of sources our singers have drawn on tonight in preparing these performances with Sarah Potter, a musicologist and singer who specialises in 19th century performance. As Sarah pointed out, playing with a score was about much more than showy ornaments and trills for Napoleonic-era musicians. Indeed, less was more if a piece was to embody romantic values of naturalness and simplicity. So alongside adding trills, twiddles and divisions, playing with a score also meant shifting tempi and dynamics, using legato and portamento to slide or carry the voice between notes, colouring the voice with breathiness, vibrato or trembling effects, or deploying the head voice or chest voice to make phrases sound brighter or more veiled, and expressive use of breathing to suggest sighing, sobbing, surprise or determination. Returning to Hoffmann, we can suggest that Ombra Adorata's openness, its simplicity, also encouraged literary experimentation and transformation. Here's a longer excerpt from his story.
The theme of the aria, Ombra Adorata, is just as simple as the recitative, but also just as soulful, penetrating to the heart of things, expressing the condition of the spirit when, filled with the blessed hope of seeing everything promised to it fulfilled in a higher, better world, it lifts itself above earthly pain. How artlessly, how naturally everything unfolds in that simple composition. The phrases move only between tonic and dominant. No flashy modulations, no contrived figures. The song flows forth like a silver bright stream between glowing flowers. But isn't this precisely the mysterious magic that the master has at his command? And he gives the simplest melody, the most artless structure, this indescribable ability to wield irresistible power over every receptive spirit. But what can I say about you, you glorious singer? With the burning enthusiasm of the Italians, I cry out to you, you, blessed by the heavens, for it must be a blessing of heaven that allows your pious, fervent spirit to ring out in bright, glorious sounds. Your tones surrounded me like lovely spirits, and each one said, "Lift up your head, weary one. Come with us to that faraway land, where pain makes no more bleeding wounds, but instead fills the breast with unnameable longing." I shall never hear you again, but whenever inanity stupefies me, the mob's disgusting derision tries to wound me, then, in your tones, a spirit voice will whisper comfortingly, "Tranquillo io sono, fra poco teco sarò mia vita." Then, in an enthusiasm such as was never felt before, I shall soar up on the mighty wings. All those tones, frozen in this wounded heart, shall revive, shall move and bestir themselves, and flicker up like glittering salamanders. And I can touch them, grasp them, and bind them together, as if in a sheaf of fire, so that they become a flaming image in which your song, you, are transfigured and glorified.
Once we get over Hoffmann's very extravagant and flamboyant kind of imagery, we can start to hear the way that he too responds to the simplicity, I think, of Ombra Adorata, the way he tries to recreate this simplicity in his verbal text. The whole plot of his story, of course, is simply a representation of hearing a concert, nothing to it. The texture of the story is also built up of simple repeated words, phrases, and structures, like the repetition of tonic and dominant in the aria. We have just as simple, just as soulful, how artlessly, how naturally, blessed by the heavens, blessing of heaven, come with us, come with us. Words for spirit and soul are patterned through the story, as are wounds, fire, enthusiasm, glory, and the word simple itself. Hoffmann also responds to and transforms the words of the recitative and aria. The text's really non-specific nature probably made it attractive to concert performances in the first place. It describes generalised feelings of calm, longing for love, joy, and reunion in a highly stylised heaven. You can find almost every phrase of the aria in other arias of the period. Hoffmann takes these sentiments and makes them into a kind of allegory. Now we're not thinking about erotic love, but the pious, fervent experience of listening to art. Romeo's address to Juliet in the recitative, Tranquillo il sonno, becomes music's promise to Hoffmann himself. Soon I will be with you, my life. Hoffmann tacitly transposes the Capulet tomb and Romeo's approaching death onto his own character's backdrop of mundane weariness, disgruntlement, and oppression. And there's a kind of final play worth mentioning with Hoffmann. As well as trying to transpose music into his text, this is a tale about transformation and transposition between media and actors. We get a hint of this at the end of the reading you've just heard. We learn that the listener doesn't just passively absorb the performance. The performance will rekindle tones frozen in his wounded heart, relying on an interior power of music belonging to him. They then become neither just sounds reawakened, nor heat and light energy, as the fire might suggest, but an image which transfigures the song and transfigures the singer. Presumably, I think, this is an image which the reader is meant to be able to share, at least to some degree. We can suppose the image is actually a text, or in a text, the tale of Ombra Adorata. Of course, as readers, we have to play along with the story for this to work. We have to continue in our imaginations the activity started by the composer, by the performer, and by the narrator-writer. But so far in this sort of allegorical reading, we've brushed over one of the most obvious transformations of our first two performances, a change of gender and voice type, from countertenor, or originally castrato, to a female soprano. And this gender change is central to our aria's history. As the rage for castrati waned, Romeo's music was increasingly sung by women. The first female Romeo in Signorelli's opera seems to have been the soprano, do I have her? Yes, Angelica Catalani in 1800. From then on, hardly any men sang the role of Romeo apart from Crescentini. As women took centre stage in operatic culture, Romeo became a successful travesty, or sort of drag role, for sopranos and mezzos. There's a good argument in musicology that roles like this, originally written for castrati, allowed women to take on personas that were powerful, independent, heroic, and that these masculine characteristics then also coloured later opera roles written especially for female alto characters, as well as some famous pants roles like Octavian in Strauss's Rosenkavalier. But it should be said that women in pants roles also had more gender-normative drawcard. They could show a lot of leg. And this is evident in quite popular images from the period of Pasta and Grisi, starring in productions of Romeo and Juliet. There's some more legs, period legs. We'll see from our next performance that women's adaptations and adoption of Romeo's music also led to more roundabout sort of play with gender and identity. The third performer you'll hear is a mezzo working with a score prepared for a very deep-voiced contralto, the young Giuseppina Grassini. Grassini had created the role of Juliet opposite Crescentini and is now best remembered for affairs with both Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington. while Hoffmann's unnamed soprano sang Ombra Adorata in a sort of decontextualised concert setting, Grassini was instead fond of adapting the music to new narrative contexts. This entailed playing with the score in more radical ways than we've seen so far, because the music Grassini presented more than once as a staged scene was really a filleted version of the whole last act of Romeo and Juliet. She took a very dramatic recitative where Romeo enters Juliet's tomb and beholds her urn for the first time, and she pasted it onto Ombra Adorata and adapted both texts to refer to female speakers. Let's hear the scene.
Ecco il luogo, ecco l'urna. Hai visto atroce, oh vi virtù di amore, oh che valore fede hanno Tomma Ferrai. Tributo amici di lagrime d'affanno, soffra la soglia sua. Quel freddo sasso in ansia me schiudete, indio fedeli miei, meco piangete. Addio! Non più compagni, andate, sola restar desio meco non bramo, che il mio dolor crudel mi dà conforto solo il barbaro affanno, ogni altro getto a me divien tiranno. Oh, mio diletto, oh caro, mai più ti rivedrò. Ai, qual dolor funesto.
can hear the difference it makes, not just to have different ornamentation, but to have a different voice type and a different musical surrounding for the aria. We know from some printed word books that Grassini performed this scene in a Gran Concerto in San Luca in 1817. The concert was advertised as extracted from Nassolini's opera The Death of Cleopatra, but in fact presented a mixture of Nassolini, Zingarelli and Crescentini's compositions. The final scene, which you've just heard, discovers the Egyptian queen in her pyramid, confronting Mark Antony's urn and looking forward to seeing her sposo adorato, her beloved husband, in Elysium. Some of my research suggests that another moment that Grassini used this scene was in her most memorable performance during her first stint on the London Opera stage in 1804, shortly before the Battle of Trafalgar. Advertised as a grand scene written especially for her by Zingarelli, the music this time represented Andromache mourning over the tomb of her husband Hector, hero of the Trojan Wars. Yet there's no record of Zingarelli writing any such piece on this theme, or of Grassini playing Andromache elsewhere in her career. The scene was first staged for the benefit night of another singer at the King's Opera House. The rest of the cast performed an entire opera for which there was no part for Grassini, but she seems to have successfully upstaged the lot of them in her in-character presentation of a paradigmatic war widow and aggrieved mother. By popular demand, the scene of Andromache at the tomb of Hector was repeated a number of times at the Opera House. The simplicity and pathos of Ombra Adorata would have played to Grassini's strengths, as well as the predilections of romantic critics in Britain. Her timbre was dark, her technique comparatively limited, and her style was called sublimely pathetic, or even excessively pathetic. One critic spoke of her as unable to, quote, divest her voice, her looks, or her action of that air of affliction or melancholy dignity which she so finely personifies. But why would Grassini have played with Ombra Adorata in the way she apparently did? Why not appear as Romeo, or as Cleopatra, or as a concert soloist like Hoffmann's soprano? I suspect this is an intriguing case of the way singers in an era of celebrity shaped their social and artistic personas through the roles they played. Fashioning a persona demanded very particular attention from Grassini in London at this time. She was vulnerable to suspicions of her as a foreigner, as a singer, and as a woman. Grassini arrived in London in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars from Paris, where she'd already been Napoleon's lover and favourite female singer, as was announced in English newspapers. Worse, she arrived at the King's Theatre to share the role of prima donna or first woman with a beloved English soprano, Elizabeth Billington, and many immediately assumed that the two were rivals. In fact, Elizabeth Billington had taken another gig and they had to bring in someone else to fill up half her parts. Now, worst of all, or potentially so, Grassini was the first contralto in living memory on the London opera stage. English listeners were clearly surprised by her voice and had trouble reconciling it with her self-presentation as a pretty, coquettish young woman. English reports describe Grassini's voice as husky, guttural, and masculine, like a chalumeau, a kind of deep, rustic clarinet. And interestingly, clarinets and deep bassoons featured very strongly in the orchestral version of the score for her grand scene from Romeo and Juliet that you've just heard. Grassini's vocal acrobatics were also held to be inferior to Billington's. Critics worried that she might have lost her high notes after a cold or in an accident, and accidents were also the euphemism for the surgery which preserved castrati's high voices. One London reporter made the connection a bit clearer, writing archly that, alone among her sex, Grassini had a falsetto range, and not a very good one at that. This was not a great time, I think, to be seen to play with gender in this context. Anticipating a trend across Europe, castrati had disappeared from the London stage, and when they occasionally came back after the Napoleonic Wars, they were treated with suspicion and often scorn. This followed on, as we've already begun to suggest, from romantic concerns for natural bodies, for a natural alignment between sex and gender, or between reproductive roles and natural characteristics like vocal pitch, appearance, and sexuality. In a post-revolutionary world, at any rate, there was less and less room for elite singers, the sort of aristocrats of the artistic world, to step outside the norms of the natural, to be extraordinary, supernatural, superfluous, like a sun king, and not simply extraordinary and different, like a kind of monster. Understandably then, Grassini seems to have worked to play down her unusual voice. She apparently never took on pants or travesty roles. She instead specialised in hyper-feminine and vulnerable characters, especially early on in her career. Appropriately, given her transnational career across war-torn Europe, her characters were often virtuous women, tragically caught between rival families and factions. Here is her as a sacrificial virgin on the left in The Virgin of the Sun, in love with a Christian but a pagan kind of oriental figure. And on the right hand, a lover caught between the warring Orazzi and Curiazzi families. So, on the London stage, an in-character performance of a simple piece would have allowed Grassini to play on her pathetic and dramatic powers. But Romeo would not have been a promising option, nor would the fallen woman Cleopatra, especially given the potential implication that Napoleon was her Mark Antony. Andromache, on the other hand, was a vulnerable and faithful war widow. According to well-known plays about the Trojan princess, Andromache turns to mourn at her husband's urn in Greek captivity, when she's threatened either with the murder of her son or marriage to Pyrrhus, whose father Achilles had killed her husband. Andromache's image was a good one to play on. It was widely used in sentimental cultures of mourning in the period, beyond the theatre, and in topical allegories about the Napoleonic Wars. To date, just one popular example, a very widely circulated print by Angelica Kaufmann showing Andromache mourning over the tomb of Hector, which you could also buy in cheap and not so cheap porcelain and earthenware reproductions to take home and sort of mourn for your own Hector in your own time. So, alongside newspaper reviews of Grassini's performance as Andromache, memoirs, and a mention in a novel, Grassini's performance was commemorated in Thomas de Quincey's autobiographical Confessions of an English Opium Eater. First published in 1821, the passage we're about to hear recalls de Quincey's first experiments with opium in his late teens. This is a sort of honeymoon period described under the heading of the pleasures of opium. He appears here not as a troubled addict, but as a connoisseur of Italian opera and of Oriental opium eating. Both, he tries to persuade us, very intellectual and both very English kinds of pleasure.
I would commit a debauch of opium, usually on a Tuesday or a Saturday night. My reason for which was this. In those days, Grassini sang at the opera, and her voice was delightful to me beyond all that I had ever heard. The choruses were divine to hear, and when Grassini appeared in some interlude, as she often did, and poured forth her passionate soul as Andromache at the tomb of Hector, etc., I questioned whether any Turk, of all that ever entered the paradise of opium eaters, can have had half the pleasure I had. But indeed, I honour the barbarians too much by supposing them capable of any pleasure approaching to the intellectual ones of an Englishman. For music is an intellectual or a sensual pleasure, according to the temperament of him who hears it. The mistake of most people is to suppose that it is by the ear they communicate with music. But this is not so. It is by the reaction of the mind upon the notices of the ear. Now, opium, by greatly increasing the activity of the mind generally, increases of necessity that particular mode of its activity by which we are able to construct out of the raw material of organic sound an elaborate intellectual pleasure. But this is a subject foreign to my present purposes. It is sufficient to say that a chorus, etc., of elaborate harmony displayed before me, as in a piece of arras work, the whole of my past life, not as if recalled by an act of memory, but as if present and incarnated in the music, no longer painful to dwell upon, but the detail of its incidents removed, or blended in some hazy abstraction, and its passions exalted, spiritualized, and sublimed. All this was to be had for 5 shillings.
Well, De Quincey responds to music very differently to Stendhal and Hoffmann. In a way, his is the most obviously playful piece, in its tone moving between the high and the low, the pathetic or teasing, its self-conscious juxtaposition of everyday penny pinching, how many times can I go to the opera for only 10 shillings, and practicalities with high rhetoric and flights of metaphysics. De Quincey also says least about what he hears. He doesn't say anything that would allow us to tell what exactly Rossini was singing. Though in a later edition of the Confessions, where De Quincey ornaments his own text in much the same way that Crescentini ornamented his own aria, we do hear that Rossini's voice was a golden epiphany, and that she sang her own welcome onto the stage like an ancient Greek harp thrumming thretinello, thretinello, electrifying the nerves of her listeners. What we do get in this excerpt is a more fleshed out view of a common 19th century aesthetic idea. Here, art is held to transform low and painful life into pleasure. Painful experience is sublimed as it becomes a ground of art. Art which takes us away from life, but also gives life back to us in another form and another medium. Here again, the medium of a visual arras work like Hoffmann's visual image that music is transformed into. And it's not incidental, I think, that a similar emotional scenario, a similar emotional transformation takes place in Romeo's own vision of a reunion with Juliet in the comforting lament of Ombra Adorata, which he builds out of his own sorrow. Finally, like Stendhal and Hoffmann, De Quincey outlines a concept of art very closely involving transformation, the shaping activity of the listener and writer alongside the composer and performer. This too takes us back to a very common Romantic era view, famously seen in Kant's belief that aesthetics unleashes free play of mental faculties. Art was to give rise to an infinite number of different sensations and thoughts that weren't reducible to any determinate concept in the real world. It's no surprise then that in this period, music, long criticised for lacking conceptual concreteness, became an ideal stimulus for aesthetics and a model for literary production. And Ombra Adorata is really kind of a Musterbeispiel. It's an excellent sort of test case of this idea. The ability of the recipient to play along or to kick back the ball in various ways becomes crucial to giving art its value, even more so than the value given to it by the notes on the page, which might, as we've seen, be very thin in themselves. In this sense, the myriad ways Ombra Adorata was played with and replayed doesn't just passively reflect its value for romantic audiences. The way it was played with and recreated helped to create this value for the romantic listener. Thank you. All that remains is for me to ask all of our singers and readers to come up and to thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.